YNABers, my name is Jesse Meekum from YNAB. It stands for You Need a Budget. Yes, you do. This is another Whiteboard Wednesday. We are continuing our series talking about my very small book on Amazon called Invest Like a Pro. We're covering all of the content, not as in-depth as the book, but kind of close, in a video series. And I think we've got a few more. So we talked last week about, well, we're kind of moving into what types of assets you can invest in. And we are not covering all assets because, as I said last week, you can invest in pretty much, in this day and age, pretty much anything. So we're going to cover just the main ones. We covered stocks last week. We talked about how you are an owner of a company and you can expect to be treated like an owner. And what that means is that you deal with risk and that we still want to diversify across owning lots of different companies instead of owning just one. Now we'll talk about bonds. In a bond situation, you are not going to be owning a part of the company. You will be lending your money to that company. And we'll talk about the secondary market in a moment. But what happens is this company wants to borrow money and you say, I want to lend you the money, and you do. And there are risks involved. What if the company goes belly up? What if they can't pay their interest payments anymore? And so what happens is when a bond is issued, the bond will, let's say it's a $1,000 face value bond. You'll say, okay, I'll give you $1,000 for that bond. And then the company turns around and says, we'll pay you 7% per year. So we'll pay you $70 a year for that $1,000 bond, and then it will mature in 5 years, 10 years, whatever, right? We'll start here at the bottom. When it comes to valuation of a bond that you're holding, imagine that you had just bought that 7% bond. So now you're stuck with it, right? And that company's paying you $70 because you invested the $1,000. And then what if suddenly interest rates go up and all of the other companies that now still need to borrow money, they're all saying, oh, well, we're paying 10%, and you're stuck with a bond that only pays you 7%. You would be sad. So maybe you would try and sell that bond, but you couldn't sell it for what you paid for. You couldn't sell it for the $1,000 because someone else that's going to buy that bond, they're saying, well, wait, why would I buy your bond that gives me 7% when I can just be be a bondholder for this company and they're paying 10%. So what would happen is instead of you getting you getting the $1,000 back, you would be getting something less than $1,000 so that new bond owner essentially was able to buy that for less and equivalently get a 10% rate of return. And that's how bonds are valued, is basically if interest rates go up, bond values go down. And if interest rates go down, you've locked in a 7% bond and suddenly companies are able to borrow for 4%, suddenly then your bond value goes up. So interest rates up, bond values go down. If interest rates go down, bond values go up. And now you don't have to be an original bond owner. What happens is, very rarely actually are you an original holder of a bond. Usually what you're doing is buying bonds on the secondary market that someone else is selling for whatever reason. Or even you can be, and we talked about index funds last week as a way to invest in stocks, but you can also use index funds essentially to invest in bonds. You can have a fund that owns many bonds, let's just say that. And that allows you to follow our same rule for investing like a pro, which is that you diversify. You don't want to own just one bond. You want to own bonds across many different companies. So just in case one goes up or one goes belly up, you've still got all the others to cover you. Bonds, in general, are less risky than stocks, and they also historically have provided a lower return. And that makes sense because there is less risk. One of the reasons there's less risk with bonds is because you are a debtor at this point. So when you have, a creditor. So when if that company does go bankrupt and you're a shareholder, you're an owner of that company, you probably will end up with nothing. Your value of that stock could eventually be zero. If you are a bondholder of a company that goes bankrupt, you are now a creditor, which means you're in line with all the other creditors to get whatever money is left over as you go through bankruptcy proceedings. Now, bondholders can be left holding the bag many times with different shenanigans of things, but all simplified, that holds true where bonds are less risky than stocks. And you may consider to kind of mix up your portfolio and hold some stocks and some bonds. There are all sorts of kind of rules of thumb. Some people say a percentage of your portfolio that should be in bonds is equal to your age. So if you're 35, 35% of your portfolio should be in bonds. If you're 60, 60% of your portfolio should be in bonds. There are ways, and we'll talk about these later when we get past vehicles and kind of get into more fancy stuff, where you can be allocating, remember how we talked about asset allocation, you can be doing that allocation automatically without really thinking about it, which is kind of my favorite thing to do. So we covered the lender versus owner, which plays into why they're less risky. And I just wanted to cover very, very briefly the different types of bonds. You'll have government bonds from the federal government, you'll have them from states, and you'll have them from cities and other municipalities. The federal government bonds, the treasuries and things like that, those are the least risky, extremely liquid, extremely safe investments. If investors are very scared of all the other investments, they all will run to treasuries. They'll all run to federal government bonds because those are safe and they're backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Next, you have different corporate bonds, and they receive different ratings. So you might have a company that's rated AAA, which is the best. You might have a company that's rated just A, not as good, that kind of thing. So again, you would be investing in different risks, different grades that kind of represent different risks. A lower grade normally would be promising a higher interest rate to compensate you for the increased risk that you're taking on. Also, there are even bonds that are called junk bonds. And it's a great name, I think, because it lets you know that these are high risk, and for that you should be receiving a higher potential return. So at the end of the day, instead of being an owner like you are with a stock, you are a creditor, you are lending money to a company. And again, just like with stock, there's a secondary market for them. And once again, you can be even smarter with the diversification and purchase stocks through funds, go as cheap as possible, and also purchase bonds through funds, go as cheap as possible. Let's just cover cash really quick. Cash, have some of it, the more the merrier, and that covers cash for us. So as you're investing, make sure that you have a little bit of a cash position as well. That just makes sense. This is above and beyond, obviously, any kind of emergency fund. This is purely for investing purposes, not not something you're using to save up for a car or something like that. All right, next week we will cover these investments again, but essentially the vehicles they ride in as they go off into the sunset toward your golden years of retirement. I will see you all next week.